Greetings, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell, and in this slideshow we're going to take a look at what happened to Darwin after he came back from his journey. Remember, in our first slideshow we talked about his chance to go on the opportunity of a lifetime to travel around the world for 5 years on the Beagle as a naturalist, collecting specimens, writing in his journals about all the adventures that happened to them and the things that he saw. In our second slideshow, we talked about some of the people who influenced Darwin and some of the ideas that he knew about before he actually went on the journey. In this slideshow, we're going to take a peek about what happens when he comes back, and also look a little bit about what is the actual theory that he came up with. As we are going through this slideshow, I want you to remember, I've been saying all year long, make connections. All of the things that we've been learning about this year connect to things that are in everyday life. It's not, biology isn't just learning or memorizing facts or definitions. We need to start seeing it as a big idea and make connections to lots of different things we've been talking about. It's not just the facts. It's more than knowing. Understanding means making those connections. And evolution is a big idea, a very big connection that connects to all sorts of biology concepts that we've been learning all year long. It's the underpinning of everything that we've been learning about. And it connects to even very common everyday things that I know you've had experience with. So as we're going through this slideshow, I want you to kind of keep an eye out and be looking for those connections as to things we've been talking about, and see if you can see the connection between evolution, the idea of living things changing over time, and some very common things in everyday life, some foods that you probably are familiar with: oranges, broccoli, and butterball turkeys. And as we go through the slideshow, kind of keep an eye out for those connections. So after 5 years, he comes back to England in this is 1836 now, and basically decides to settle down. He had a girlfriend, Fanny, that promised to write to him and while he was on his journey and wait for him till he came back. But along the way, he received a letter saying that she had met someone and was going to get married. So he comes back and kind of decides that this is a time in his life when he should settle down and be respectable, have a wife and start a family. So, as was common in those days, he married his cousin Emma, who was heir to the wood pottery family and came from a wealthy background. His father, remember, was very wealthy, and allowed Darwin to kind of settle down and spend time looking through all of his journals, looking at the specimens, really thinking about it and studying those. So he comes back from his trip with notebooks filled with ideas, and remember, he's thinking about this idea of biodiversity. Where did all the different organisms come from? Remember, he's asked what's that idea of the mystery of mysteries? Where do new species come from? And spends about 25 years of his life actually working on that idea and looking at the specimens, looking at evidence, and eventually came up with what would become the theory of evolution. As he's thinking now about all these things, he's getting this idea in his head, but he doesn't really rush to publish his ideas. And remember, we talked about that idea that at the time, scientists, the church, politicians, basically the whole foundation of society that he lived in didn't really accept the idea that living things changed over time. His idea that he was thinking about, that living things changed, really disagreed with everything that was kind of the basic fundamentals of science at that time. And remember, he really didn't want to kind of disrupt the life he was leading. He came back as a famous world traveler. He went on the lecture circuit, talked about his specimens and the adventures he'd had. He got to know the well-known scientists of the day. He was kind of famous and a celebrity, and we kind of talked about the idea of he didn't really want to disappoint his father. He had kind of made a name for himself now and was respectable in his father's eyes. So he spends years and years doing his research, looking at his specimens, looking through his journals. And what he decides to do is to ask his wife to publish his ideas after he dies. Kind of takes the chicken way out. Instead of facing the kind of the uproar that he knew would come, he knew bad things could happen to him if he started talking about these ideas. And so he decides to just wait until he dies, and then his wife can publish. And then something happens to change his mind. Another scientist, a young scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace, writes Darwin a letter. And here's what the letter says. Dear Mr. Darwin, I know you're a famous scientist, and I've heard about your travels around the world, and I kind of did the same thing. I went on a journey just like you did, and what Wallace did was to travel around through the jungles of Malaysia in Indonesia, and he kind of did what Darwin did, go on an adventure, trek around in nature, collect specimens, keep logs, and write about the things that he saw, and he starts to come up with an idea. The same idea that Darwin had, the idea that living things change over time. So he writes Darwin a letter. He says, Mr. Darwin, I'm thinking, I had this adventure, I have all these specimens I've been collecting, I've been thinking about this idea of living things changing over time, and I'm writing this paper about it that I would like to publish, and would you do me the honor of looking at my paper and giving me some pointers? So Darwin reads the paper, and what do you think? It's exactly his idea, that living things changed over time. The idea that he has spent the last 25 years working on and devoting his life to, and all of those things that happened to him, and the specimens he collected. And now here comes this young scientist who's going to get credit for Darwin's idea. So Darwin decides to publish. He has incentive to publish his work. In 1859, he publishes a book called On the Origin of Species, and he presents his evidence for this idea of living things change over time. Notice now, Wallace has talked about this idea of evolution of living things. They weren't the first people to talk about it. We talked about Lamarck. Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, also was convinced that living things change over time. Lots of people had kind of talked about this over time at different times, but Darwin gets credit for the idea of evolution because he's the one that actually came up and proposed a mechanism. How could this actually happen? I mean, he's called his idea natural selection. Remember, we talked about Lamarck proposing that living things changed over time, but he doesn't get credit for the theory because he didn't really have the mechanism quite figured out, that idea of inheritance of acquired trait. That's not how it works. But Darwin actually came up with an idea and proposed how this could actually happen, and that's why he gets credit for the theory of evolution. And Wallace and Darwin actually went together on the lecture circuit, and they went around speaking together and talking about their ideas, showing their specimens. But Darwin is really the one who gets credit because he had worked so long and so hard and had so much evidence to support his mechanism. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of theory.
Isn't evolution just a theory?
It is a common misconception among non-scientists that evolution is just a theory, but I think that comes from them thinking that a theory is sort of a careless idea that really doesn't have a lot of evidence. It's probably wrong anyway.
In everyday language, a theory basically is a hunch or a guess, but in science it is not.
Theories are the heart of science. They pull together observations, laws,
It is a common misconception among non-scientists that evolution is just a theory, but I think that comes from them thinking that a theory
Isn't evolution just a theory?
It is a common misconception among non-scientists that evolution is just a theory. But I think that comes from them thinking that a theory is sort of a careless idea that really doesn't have a lot of evidence. It's probably wrong anyway.
In everyday language, a theory it basically is a hunch or a guess, but in science it is not.
Theories are the heart of science. They pull together observations, laws, hypotheses, and inferences into coherent explanations for the great mysteries of the universe. In the 1800s, Charles Darwin observed the enormous diversity of life on Earth and set out to explain it. From the evidence he collected, Darwin developed his theory of evolution by natural selection, the theory that explains how new species originate.
If the globe has undergone such profound changes in its history, geologically, surely all living creatures must have changed with it to adapt to their new conditions. Well, otherwise they would have perished.
What theory does is it draws the ideas together, it draws observations together, and makes sense of them to allow you to make expectations. That's what a theory is. And then we go and test those expectations.
People used to believe that the sun revolved around the Earth because that's how it looked. Over time, the steady accumulation of evidence supported a different theory, that the Earth and other planets revolve around the sun. And what about gravity? Have you ever said, "Oh, gravity, it's just a theory. I don't believe in it"?
A lot of people seem to think that you need to be able to see something directly in order to accept it as a good scientific idea. But in reality, all you're seeing when you see a book falling are the effects of gravity. You're not really seeing gravity itself. Gravity is something, in terms of gravitation theory, something that we have yet to fully explain.
Even so, we still rely on theories to make predictions that help us conduct our lives, to travel, to heal the sick, and to explore the universe.
Apollo 11, this is Houston, over.
Before anyone had ever traveled to the moon, NASA scientists applied gravitation theory to predict what it would be like to move in the lunar environment. Predictions like these are called inferences. An inference is a conclusion you can draw from the available evidence.
If I place this cube on the table, and you have the 5 and the 1 and the 3 and the 6 and the 4, what would you say is on the bottom? Again, you have the 5 and the 1 and the 3 and the 6 and the 4. One can infer by looking at the data that's the observable data that number 2 would be at the bottom.
Charles Darwin inferred from the evidence available to him that all living creatures, including humans, descended from a common ancestor.
I think it's more like a tree. A tree of life. Each new species is a new shoot that springs from the parent tree. These new shoots branch out and develop in their turn, and so on. Some branches die out, others keep developing. The trunk, the ancient common ancestor.
Today, scientists continue to find evidence that supports Darwin's common ancestor inference in the fossil record and in genes. With new discoveries, details of scientific theories are refined, and scientists are comfortable with the notion that theories are constantly challenged and amended. That's the nature of science. If apples suddenly start rising, you can be sure that some aspect of gravitation theory will change. But science will not reject the very idea that there is a force called gravity. New discoveries may also refine elements of the theory of evolution by natural selection. But the notion that the Earth and its inhabitants have evolved from a common ancestor will not change.
I don't think any person with even a small amount of scientific background would reject cell theory or atomic theory or germ theory, that pathogens cause disease, just because we think of those ideas as theories.
The theory of evolution is no different. Like other scientific theories, evolution also helps us make sense of the natural world in which we live.
So let's talk about this idea of the word theory, because a lot of people who don't believe in evolution say, well, it's just a theory, and that's a misunderstanding about what the word theory means. In common language, theory kind of means a guess or a hunch, as you saw in the movie. But that's not what it means to a scientist. When you call something a theory in science, it means it's supported by evidence. It's not a guess. There's evidence to support it. It's testable. We can do experiments. And what a theory does is a big idea that ties together an explanation of all different kinds of things that we see happening, different kinds of evidence from all different places that tie together into one big idea that explains something. And so we have lots of theories in science. Gravitational theory. In our cell parts chapter, we learn about cell theory, atomic theory. When scientists call something a theory, it means something different than the average, what we use in average everyday language. So theories mean that it's supported, it's testable, we have evidence